Okay, so this is Frank Lloyd Wright in Kalamazoo. Yay! Okay. Frank Lloyd Wright, I mean, there's not a lot of architects that have their own stamps. I think that's very indicative of how iconic he is in the United States and to a certain degree throughout the world in terms of being the architect. If there's any one name, if you say, you know, who's an architect that you recognize, Frank Lloyd Wright is the name that people are just going to really recognize because he is the 20th century architect in the United States that's the best known. But there are other architects that had an impact on Kalamazoo in one way or another. They had, we have, you know, Henry Hobson Richardson, the Richardsonian Romanesque style. We have many buildings in Kalamazoo that were influenced by his style, including our train station down at the bottom. That black and white photo is our train station with the deep arches. And of course, the new transportation center that was built to complement that. Again, it echoes those same heavy Richardsonian Romanesque arches that were built throughout the United States. They're very, very popular. So he had an influence on Kalamazoo. We were lucky enough to have other architects who actually built buildings in Kalamazoo, or not built them, but designed buildings in Kalamazoo. We have Louis Sullivan, who was the late 19th century, was one of the most famous architects in the United States, influenced many, many projects. Wright actually worked for him for quite a while. And he and Adler, his partner, Dankmar Adler, designed the picture at the top, which is our former Academy of Music that burned down in the 1920s. That was designed by the two of them. And we also have the only surviving Louis Sullivan building in the state of Michigan, the building that's now the bank, can't see the name of it, Huntington Bank, downtown. That building was designed by Louis Sullivan for Henry Diesenberg here in Kalamazoo. So we actually have a Louis Sullivan building here. There have been other nationally known architects that have built buildings. There's a house architect that built probably a dozen houses, or designed a dozen houses in Kalamazoo. And then we have, of course, Albert Kahn, who designed not only the Kalamazoo Gazette building and the Upjohn World Headquarters building, but the now gone Upjohn Research, well, it was known as the Research Tower, but actually was originally the factory because it was a top-down manufacturing facility built in the 1930s. He also, and a lot of people don't know this, he designed the Upjohn part of the Parkwood Upjohn School. So that front section that faces on Inkster was designed by Louis Kahn. So we've had a good share of nationally known architects that have worked in Kalamazoo, but Wright is probably the one that everyone in the U.S. would also recognize as an architect. So Frank Lloyd Wright, just a little bit about him. He was born in 1867, and he lived into 1959. He was born in Jones Valley, Wisconsin. The Jones Valley is where his mother's family moved from Wales in the previous generation. So many of the people that lived in that valley were his family, his aunts, uncles, cousins, that kind of thing. His mother was Anna Lloyd Jones Wright, and his father was William Russell Corey Wright, who was a minister. He went back and forth between the Methodists and the Unitarians. He was kind of Christian, but he went back and forth a little bit. But according to Wright himself, when he wrote his autobiography in the 1920s and 30s, his mother knew he would be an architect from the day he was born. So we may want to take that with just a little grain of salt, because I've been the mother of kids, and there's some things that I said when they were 1 year old that not the same things I said when they were 25. So, and I'm sure that what she was telling him might have changed over time as well. She was actually a teacher by trade, so she was used to the idea of teaching children, and she was a very forward-looking teacher, because she was more of espoused the idea of teaching children rather than just having them memorize everything. This was the time when American education was substantially changing from rote memorization to the idea that children need to learn and absorb knowledge in a more orderly way. Maria Montessori was starting to teach at about this same time period. So Wright spent his early childhood, this is what he called it. He called it the Valley. He said it was beautiful, it was inviting, it was lines of demarcation between agriculture and everything else. And to him, this was the ideal of the perfect setting for a home. He liked the idea that root houses, especially, that were partially dug into the landscape and blended into the landscape as they protected the root crops over the winter. He really, really liked that concept of the landscape blending in. And so this is a picture of him at about that just about the time when he left home. One of the things that his mother did get for him was what was called at the time, and still are available today, they're called Frobel Blocks. And it's different sets, it's 7 or 8 different sets of blocks, starting with very simple ones for the youngest children. And each set is called a gift, so they're actually called Frobel gifts. And they start with simple shapes, and they build up, and they build on different concepts until the point where the child is working with the full set and is building and imagining. So it's a really great imaginative play. But if you look at them, they're a really lot like, we buy blocks for kids like this today. Comes in a little wagon, and it's got an arch shape, and it's got a tube, and it's got a little, square cylinder, and it's got some square blocks, and it's got some larger blocks, and they're painted red and blue and yellow. And that's the same concept, was the idea of you give the kids the units of material to work with, not necessarily a finished product, which we tend to do more with kids now. But anyway, the Frobel blocks are an old idea. They were invented by Wilhelm Frobel, who was the person who came up with the idea of kindergarten, the idea of teaching children from the time they were very young in an orderly way so they could absorb things and not necessarily just memorize everything, so they could understand as well as learn. Wright did go to Madison High School. There's no clear evidence that he graduated. He was admitted to the University of Wisconsin in Madison as a special student. It probably means that he had not graduated from high school. But nonetheless, he was there, but he was only there for about a year. He decided he wanted to go off to Chicago. He'd had some experience at that time working on a chapel that was built in his family's valley, working with that. And so he left the university, went to Chicago, and he first became a draftsman for Joseph Lyman Silsby, who was an architect in Chicago. Not one of the best-known ones, but it's a good start. He moved over to Adler and Sullivan from 1888 to 1893, when he was so he would have been about 21 years old to about 25 years old, 28 years old. So he was a young man. This was during the time period when he got married. He borrowed money from Sullivan to design and build his family's home in Oak Park, and with the idea that he would continue working for the firm and he would pay back as he continued working for the firm. Well, during this time period, he was so taken with the idea of designing houses that he started designing houses on his own time and taking contracts and kind of playing a little bit on the name of Adler and Sullivan. And there was quite a blow-up between him and Sullivan, because Sullivan was essentially his mentor for those years, and he felt very betrayed by the fact that his young apprentice here essentially was designing houses for other people. He even calls them himself, he calls them the bootleg houses. So he kind of knew what he was up to. But by 1894, he was working independently, working on his own. He had his own little office, his own little draftsman. And by the time he got to 1901, he designed this house, the one at the bottom there, for Ladies' Home Journal. At the time, the editor of the Ladies' Home Journal, Edward Bach, believed that American homes could be much improved by good architectural design. He came up with what was at the time pretty wild ideas of having cross-ventilation in every room, including the servants' room, maybe not having servants. He espoused the idea of a living room, a room that the family would actually use rather than a parlor, which was always set aside for company, that sort of thing. And so he asked architects to design houses. The first 10 that were designed in 1898, there was no architect's name on them. There were just the houses, and hundreds, if not thousands of them were built nationwide because the plans were only $5 and they were architect-designed homes. The next round, he decided he wanted to have the architects' names on them, and Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the people that designed one of his houses. Now, the plans were not $5 by that point, but they were still very reasonably priced. And this house has actually been built in a couple of places. So he's getting these ideas, and if you think about what we normally think of as a house built around 1900, it doesn't look anything like this. This looks like a ranch home that you could build out in Oshtemo today, but it's nothing like what most people were building during that time period. Oh, wait a minute. There we go. Okay. By 1909, he had left his family in their home in Oak Park, and he went off to Europe with the wife of one of his clients. And it's an interesting story. If you want to read it, it's covered fairly well in a book called Loving Frank. Okay, it's a good story, and I'm not going to go into it here because it has nothing to do with him in Kalamazoo. It was tempting because it's a darn good story, but I'm not going to. So he did go to Europe in 1909, and he was getting well known enough in Europe that actually a publisher in Berlin asked to publish a a set of his drawings, and those are still, they were very valuable. If you come across a set of these at a garage sale, baby, give them whatever they want for them. Okay? Studies and Executed Buildings of Frank Lloyd Wright, published in 1911, known as the Wasmuth Portfolio. So if you found an actual copy, it wouldn't say the Wasmuth Portfolio. It would have that title on it. By 1911, he was back in the States, and at that point he built Taliesin, the first Taliesin, in his hometown in Spring Green, Wisconsin, in the hillside. And this was the home that he and his new wife would live in. I can't remember the exact year, but within a couple of years after he built it, there was a tragic combination murder-fire that decimated his family, more than decimated, it destroyed his family. And the house was burned to the ground. And then he later rebuilt another building, Taliesin II, on the same site. Again, it's in Loving Frank, so if you want to read it, it's a really good story. It's also in the PBS special they did on Frank Lloyd Wright about 4 or 5 years ago. So now what Wright was coming up with, by the time he was moving through, he was getting more and more clients all the time in the teens, and by the 1920s he was coming up with this idea of what he called textile blocks. These are interlocking blocks that are set in a matrix of steel rods. You can put them together yourself, if you can cast the concrete yourself. And at this point in time, the idea of casting your own concrete blocks was very popular. Sears offered a mod, a block mold. You know, you could buy like a dozen of them, cast up a few blocks over the weekend, and eventually you'd have enough to build your whole house with different faces on. So he was working into the build your own house or design your own house or kit-built houses that was going on during this time period. It made the houses less expensive. If you think about the fact that back in that time period, if you were building a house, you were building a house from wood. Every single board had to be sawn by hand. Okay? If you buy a pre-cut house, like more than half of the work is already done for you. You just have to put it together, nail it together. This is kind of the same idea. You could get the parts, you could build them for yourself, and you could have a nice, sound home that had been designed by an architect. So the original specifications called the blocks would be made of Portland cement and sand or decomposed granite mixed with water. The consistency would be, they would hold its shape when it was squeezed by hand. So a little bit crumbly, but not a lot, kind of Play-Doh-ish, not quite so sticky, but about that thickness, if you think of it. You had to mix it and you had to cast your block within half an hour. So you'd mix up enough for a few blocks, you'd fill the blocks up, you'd let them set up, and then you could do more. They tended to be formed on site by pressing the stiff mixture into machined metal molds. And then they had to be removed from the mold. So you could really get quite a process going here over like a long weekend, but they had to be kept damp for the next few days while they began to cure. So, but the instructions were not all that hard. Now this is something that he had some of his houses built from elsewhere in the United States, but this was something that was going to become a key feature of the Usonian homes. Wright first came up with the idea of a Usonian house. He said that a small house on the side street might have charm if it didn't ape the big house on the avenue. And at that time period, most of what you found was you'd have a nice, handsome middle-class home or maybe upper-middle-class home, and then the house that was supposed to be for the common man, the less expensive one, would be very similar in design, but it would just be smaller. It might be only 4 rooms instead of 8, that kind of thing. So that's what he's talking about, is if we're going to make something for everyday people to live in that's going to be a reasonable, inexpensive cost, this is a man who constantly ran over his budget, so reasonable, inexpensive cost might be a concept that he wasn't entirely familiar with. But nonetheless, he wanted it to be simple, he wanted it to be able to be clean, he wanted it to be a house that could operate without servants, and he didn't like basements or attics. He liked utilitarian, useful space that was welcoming, okay? So one of the first houses that he designed was for Herbert Jacobs in Madison, Wisconsin, and this is the house he designed. This is not using the textile blocks, this is using wood, and a plywood sandwich design is what he had going here. And Mr. Jacobs did not have a lot of money, so he wanted something inexpensive. He didn't want anything really high-end, but he wanted a good house designed by an architect. He designed another one in 1940 in the Hanna House in Stanford, California. That's actually a very handsome house because it actually has sort of a honeycomb design. So instead of being on a square grid, he decided to go to a honeycomb for this. He didn't do a lot of those. Later, many years later, Wright's son, who was known as Lloyd Wright, characterized, someone was talking to him, an author was talking to him and said, your father's design is all laid out on graph paper. And he said, and while he's talking about his theory of Frank Lloyd Wright's design, the sun is going like this. It's going like this. He said, yep, the grid and cantilevers. Those are the two key things in Frank Lloyd Wright's designs. He liked cantilevered overhangs, things that people could stand on, porches. If you've ever been, who's been to falling water? Okay, you know what I mean by cantilevers then, okay? So yes, absolutely cantilevers. Now, just to put this in perspective, what the Jacobs houses what they wanted in Madison was they wanted a house that cost them less than $5,000, $5,000 or less. And at that point in time, 1937, the average cost of a new house was $4,100. So he was talking about spending a little bit more than the average house. And the average wages per year was $1,780. That was throughout the United States. So he was talking about building a house that he might have thought of it as being reasonably priced, but it was going to be just a little bit above what we consider middle class. So he was striving just a little bit more than that. I don't know how close Wright came to actually hitting that mark. I know that he went way over on a lot of other things. So in a Usonian house, typically the private spaces, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, are very compact spaces. They're utilitarian spaces. All we do is sleep here. All we do is take a shower, wash up, use the toilet in this room. We don't need it to be big and fancy. He made the biggest spaces in his homes, in the Usonian homes, were the living room, the living dining room area. He also had no idea what kitchens were. And so he designed essentially galley kitchens that were shrunken a little bit. They were very, very tightly spaced. So they were very compact. My personal theory is that Wright himself was only 5'5". So for him it was like, what do you need all this space for? You know, and for those of you who are a little bigger than that, you'd probably appreciate the fact that a little bit more size would be really great. But Wright admitted at one point when one of his clients asked him, you know, well, why is the kitchen so small? And he said, well, I've never been in one. Isn't this good enough? You know, like, no, it's not. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about Wright in Kalamazoo. This is the height that Wright had risen to by 1938. By the time he was 1938, he would have been 50. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He designed a community called Broadacre City that was an entirely, totally designed, planned community with everything you could possibly imagine was right really close. Like we're doing planned communities today, kind of with the same idea. But Broadacre City was very dismissing of the cities themselves, and he wanted to recreate something that was, in his mind, the perfect place to live. I should mention that it never was realized, although bits and pieces of it have been built nationwide. So in Kalamazoo, what we had was after the war, the Upjohn Company was flourishing. Even during the Depression, Upjohn had done very, very well. They had built their Albert Kahn buildings. During the Depression, they had extra funds they needed to use up to do it, so it's not like they even had to borrow to do it. They were prospering. They were doing very well. People might be really, really poor because of the Depression, but they still needed the medications that the Upjohn Company offered. So after the war was over, and Upjohn had been very involved in helping to develop antibiotics, they started getting pretty busy hiring people. So there's this whole group of new scientists that joined the company. They were a little bit idealist, and what they wanted to do was have reasonably priced homes, to have a community that was egalitarian but had individual ownership. Common spaces would be owned jointly. The houses would be designed individually, and they were looking for an architect and planner that could guide them through this process that they could all agree on. Well, the first thing is that they couldn't agree to do it all together, but they did go looking at a site. Well, I thought this was very interesting, that Ingersoll had during the war, where the Lowe's is right now. They'd used it for a tank proving ground. When they were working on some of the tanks that Ingersoll built, they would take them there, and so it had been all kind of torn up, and it had some, as the article said, very interesting contours. So that's a place they decided it wasn't enough acreage, so it wasn't what they wanted, and it was too far out. Some of the people, this is part of what sparked the discussion about how far out do we want to live. Do we want to live close into town, or do we want to live further out? And they eventually broke up into two groups. One group that chose the site of today's Parkman Village, which at that point in time, Winchell was the city limits. So it was just barely outside the city limits. And the other group decided they wanted to be in Charleston Township, just outside Galesburg, that was a little more country, a little more rural. So they went through, but it was a very, very amicable split. There weren't bad feelings. It was like, okay, you guys, that's what you want, this is what we want, we're going to just go ahead and see if we can work together on this and keep working. One of the other things they looked at was what was called the Ingersoll Houses. And this concept was actually folded into the Wright designs, but the Ingersoll core was a utility core where that's one place is where the water came into the house, where the furnace was, the water heater was all in one piece that you could just buy the piece, install it in the middle of the house, and everything would be connected up to it. So really, in terms of house building, it was a very efficient idea rather than having the furnace brought in separately in here, the water heater there, the water for other systems and everything. It was all one piece that was right in the center of the house, and the house was designed around it. Over on, I'm trying to remember, not Alamo Drive. Anyway, maybe it is Alamo. That's where the Ingersoll Village is. And they actually had 8 to 10 houses that were designed by different architects around this core. And the village is still there. It's out in Kalamazoo Township. So the group talked to Alden Dow, who was a very, very well-known Michigan architect. They talked to a bunch of other architects. And according to Richard Levin, who built one of the houses in Parkman, all the other architects said, well, you should ask Wright, but he won't do it. And so they figured, what the heck? We're going to ask Wright. And he said yes. He agreed he'd work with him. He came and he visited to Kalamazoo. Then this was, at this point, they had pretty much decided they wanted 2 different communities, which didn't bother him at all, because then he got 2 fees for designing the layout and the plan of the area rather than just 1. But he visited Kalamazoo in November 1947. He delivered a lecture and he met with the association. And what he called it was, he said, the Parkman Project is an example of the true democracy in action because it represents a group of people working together to achieve individual freedom. So he was very much for that concept of every family on their own, but nonetheless working cooperatively with neighbors. So he was in Kalamazoo. He came often. He came, as far as I can tell, he came probably 4 or 5 times, which for an architect of his stature is really an awful lot. He walked the Parkman and the Acres properties, the Parkman Village area at that time. We think of it now with all the trees. A lot of the family members that bought into the Parkman Village area, they planted those trees. When they first moved there were 4 trees. 3 apple trees and 1 other small tree, and the rest of it was just bare land. It wasn't anything there. And today, of course, it's very heavily wooded and very beautiful. Both sites did have gently rolling hills with some mature trees, but not a lot. More out in the Acres than in Parkman Village, and water either nearby or in the area. So with Parkman Village, you had Asylum Lake, and I think it's called Shepherd's Lake is the little lake that feeds into Asylum Lake. And then out in Galesburg, you also had some other water moving through it. And he was designing the community. He wasn't just designing the houses. He was going to lay out the land, where the road's going to go. He wanted very much for all the utilities to be underground, for the electric lines to be underground. And this was kind of a new idea at the time. The electric companies didn't especially like the idea of putting them underground. They were very obstinate about that at first. So this is a picture of Wright about the time that he was actually began to be involved with the houses here in Kalamazoo. This was taken by his photographer Pedro Guerrero, which he's going to have a PBS special sometime in the next couple of months, talking about the photography he did of Wright's architecture as well as of Wright himself over the years. But he was very involved in planning the community and trying to get everything set up so that the people who were going to live in these 2 communities would be comfortable and would be able to achieve their dreams with a lot of sweat equity. They were meeting at least monthly, if not more often, because they were all buying the land together. So every lot that didn't sell, they were trying to sell the lots, they were doing other things, they were working on the property, they were planting trees, and they had a lot to do, so they were working pretty hard at it. They wanted to promote the communities as well. Wright completed the plat plans in 1949, and then the groups put together promotional materials. They went to the county fair, they'd go and talk to groups, they'd hand out materials. They were recruiting, they were trying to sell the lots, they were trying to get more people to buy into the whole project. And this is the document they produced right there. It was something they would hand out to people, and then you could buy a share, and you'd pay a certain amount, and you'd buy your share, and then that would give you the rights to the lot, and then you'd have to pay to have your house built. And then you'd have to pay a regular fee, which I believe, is there anybody here from Parkman or the Acres? Okay, so you still do pay a fee to the community association? Okay. If I get anything horribly wrong, I'm going to ask you to correct me at the end. But this is from the research that I've done. Okay, now there was a hitch because the association was set up as an egalitarian community. The compact, the agreement that everybody signed when they became a member, said that there would be no discrimination based on race, religion, color, national origin, any of that. Okay, and that sounded really, really good on paper until an African American woman actually applied, and she had the resources. She met all the qualifications, so the membership committee approved her. And at that point in time, they had something over 20 members. Don't know the exact number when this happened, but the membership committee accepted her because she met all the expectations. And then at that point in time, and over the next few months, they lost 10 members. Now, some of this was attrition because as maybe someone got a new job and had to move out of town, but some of them left because they said if we have a black family living near us, our family from Alabama won't stay with us when they visit. And they felt that was really going to be a concern. They couldn't deal with it. So they just left, but what that meant, though, was that according to the agreement, it meant that the other members had to buy them out. So this was a financial hit on the remaining members as well as being something that was, kind of normal for the time. When we think of it now as kind of trivial, but nonetheless, at that time, it was pretty standard. And she later withdrew. She was never able to actually be a member and have a house. So this is how the textile blocks went together. This is how the houses in Parkman and in the acres were going to be built, essentially, was using the textile blocks. The family would either cast them themselves. The molds were going to be provided originally by Lloyd Wright. That didn't come through, and other people provided the molds. There was an architect in Florida that made the molds for some of the families. But this is how they went together. So when you're talking about the blocks that were, they were kind of hollow in the middle, this is not a complete block right here. These are not connected. This is a dead airspace in between, but the frame of the steel rods is connected. So what this makes is a dead airspace in between. So each block that's cast up is essentially flat on two sides, and then it has this channel all the way around the edge. Sometimes there's a pattern on the face. Sometimes they're just plain blank and flat on both sides. It depends on what the design is for the specific house. The dead airspace was supposed to provide insulation, but it didn't necessarily work as well as they'd hoped it would. The deep eaves helped a lot in terms of keeping the house comfortable in the summer, but it didn't help quite so much in the winter. The Weiss Blatts, who lived out in the acres, they found that even in the winter when the heat went off, it took almost 2 days for them to start feeling uncomfortable. So something was working. The heat sink, the heat of all the concrete around you holding the heat was actually working fairly well. But I can't say that my house would be still comfortable 2 days after the heat went off in the winter. So that's pretty impressive. This is just a cartoon that Fred Cooper did of making the blocks. He did several cartoons. I think he was a member of the group, and he did several cartoons throughout the entire process that illustrated the newsletter that the children put out later and other things. So this is what it pretty much looked like. I'm not sure who the watchers are, whether that's just a crowd from the local press or what exactly, but those are the people working on them. So this is the layout that Wright originally did for Parkman Village. He wanted the lots to be approximately an acre for the full circles and a little bit less for the partial circles, and that they would be round, and that the space in between the round lots would be common area that everyone would help take care of, and that would give that sense of the country, that sense of space and green around, but your neighbor would actually be fairly nearby. At that point in time, this was in Kalamazoo Township, and the township said, fine, looks good to us. FHA, however, had a totally different idea. They refused the financing. Wright appealed it to Washington, D.C., and there's one of Fred's cartoons of someone going to Washington and trying to appeal that decision. The FHA was vital for the financing of the whole thing. If the families wanted to build their houses, they needed Federal Housing Administration financing to make it work. And so when they said, no, we won't finance and we will not insure if you have these round lots, then they had to, so they did have to have it replatted, which was very disappointing to them. But that wasn't actually completed until 1954. They built the lots, the houses on their round lots, but then the platting drawing the lines had to be redone at a later date in 1954. So this is just a barbecue. The families would get together and they would socialize a lot. I don't think that's a Usonian barbecue. I think that's just what we have made. We're going to make it from leftover stuff. They wanted the electric lines to be underground. Consumers eventually agreed that they would do it, but it was a real hard sell because they had not done underground utilities at that point yet. There are 4 Usonian designs in Parkwood Village. Some of them are tucked in from the hillside. The land, the infrastructure, platting, and the tennis court cost $50,472 total. That was for the common areas and buying the land in the first place. If you ever want to go to Parkman Village, I can only encourage you very strongly to stay on the road itself. But you're not going to see the houses very well. You're actually going to see the houses better by going online and searching for Parkman Village, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Kalamazoo, because they're designed to be relatively invisible from the street and to open onto the vistas in front of them. Okay? So you'll see the roofs from the sidewalk generally or from the road. So one of the first houses that really got started was the Eric and Ann Brown house. The Browns actually asked Wright to consolidate. They had 3 tiny bedrooms, one for each of the boys, and they said, could you please just make it one big room, and then we'll deal with that. We can handle that. And he did. He was willing to make that kind of a renegotiation or a redesign. But I wanted to read you this little story about the Browns. This is called A Frank Tale. The man on the telephone calls Mr. Brown and says, hello, this is Frank Lloyd Wright's assistant calling from St. Joseph, Michigan. Mr. Brown, I'm sorry, but Mr. Wright gave me just the last names he took before he took off, and such a common name. Are you the Mr. Brown where Mr. Wright stayed last night? Yes? Okay, the Mr. Brown's wife that doesn't like to cook? Okay. The Mr. Brown who made his special pancakes that morning for Mr. Wright's breakfast? Well, yeah, okay. No, I'm not calling for the recipe. I've just put Mr. Wright on a friend's plane to take him home to Spring Green. He's been feeling terribly ill. He thinks it's the pancakes. What was in those pancakes? Mr. Wright says he'll need to tell his doctor. He wonders whether or not you tried to poison him. He's thinking of suing you. Now, Mr. Brown, don't worry. I assured him that obviously you certainly wouldn't be poisoning him before you got your finished plans. It's like, of course not. We'll wait till the plans are done. So Wright could be very picky. He wanted you to use only his furniture. He wanted you not to put decorations in unless he approved them. He didn't like photographs on the walls. He thought they were tacky. He just, it was Frank's way or the highway, basically. So this is what the Eric and Ann Brown house looks like on the inside. It's actually, that living room space is a wonderful vaulted space. It's absolutely beautiful. It was designed because Mrs. Brown, Ann Brown, taught piano. And so there was room in there for 2 grand pianos, and the chairs were designed in such a way that they could be either used for the family or they could be rearranged for a recital in the living room. And he even designed it to make sure that the bright sunlight would never be on the pianos. So he really did a good job. Now, they also wanted a fireplace, but they wanted in the summer, when they wouldn't be using the fireplace, they wanted to have a little sunken pool that they could have goldfish in or something. And if you look at that fireplace, you can see that the hearth is actually sunk down into the floor around it. And it actually was a pool in the summer that they could put water in and have, I guess, little fish or something. But it was a water garden in the summer. I think it's kind of inventive, really. Because that's what we all need inside our houses in the summer is more humidity, right? So these are some other pictures of it. This is Ann Brown on the roof, actually working on some of the work. The blocks were made by a friend. The forms were made by a friend with the foundry, and contractors actually put the house together. Generally, the Browns helped a great deal. However, it took 1.5 years to build. They did add a basement for the furnace. Wright never would have approved that, but he would not have approved that at all. They did not use the Wright design chairs. Instead, they had our local architect, Norman Carver, design backs for the hassocks, the low chairs that Wright had designed, because they felt that the Wright design was actually very uncomfortable, but they didn't mind the hassocks. The hassocks were okay, and so they just had Norm Carver embellish them and change them a bit. So this is what it looks like from the outside, and you don't really, it doesn't have it's from the outside. And this is a view from the yard. You would not get this from Taliesin Drive. The Ward and Helen McCartney House. She again also did not build all the furniture that Wright designed. The dining room table, though, was kind of interesting, and you can see it in the far end from this picture. It was actually triangular pieces, which could be rearranged into different shapes. You could rearrange it into a circle. It could be a long, narrow table. I think that's pretty inventive, actually. The kids originally slept on bunk beds in a closet until they could get 2 bedrooms added on, because it was a little bit small. This is, even today when it has more space, it's still a jewel box of a house. I mean, it's little. The living room area is expansive and beautiful. The folks in this picture that are on the left are the new owners. And they have worked on Wright houses. John has worked on Wright House, one of the Wright houses, the Weiss Blatt house out in the Acres, as well as when he was able to buy this one. He was just absolutely thrilled. He's been doing beautiful work. If you just search for the McCartney House, Frank Lloyd Wright, Kalamazoo, Michigan, you will probably stumble upon his blog of blow-by-blow projects that he's been doing on the house, including resculpting the yard back to its original configuration. So he's been doing a lot of work on it. Beautiful work. Oh, wait a minute, that's the other story. The other story, the McCartney House. So this time it's another phone call. A man on the telephone. Hello, yes, this is Mr. Wright's assistant. Oh, this is Mrs. McCartney. What can I do for you? You say you've been examining your house plans and there's something missing. What's missing? What's missing? A second door. You say there's only one door to the outside? No exterior door from the kitchen area? Only the front door by the living room? Well, you know Mr. Wright. I'm sure if the plan's that way, Mr. Wright intended it to be that way. Now, Mrs. McCartney, don't get so upset. I'm sure you can adapt. Now, do you really think you need another door besides the living room one? You can't imagine what you do about the children tracking in mud and their sports stuff and all Ward's gardening mess, and you want me to ask Mr. Wright what? Oh, whether you're expected to carry your garbage out the front door? Well, why not? I'm sure your dinner guests won't mind. It just whets the appetite. You say if Mr. Wright won't alter this, you will just have to get someone else to make a change? Really? You put in that door and Mr. Wright will not consider your house as his plan. Mrs. McCartney? Mrs. McCartney? Frank Lloyd Wright did not add the other door. The McCartneys did, and Wright never set foot in the house. And they survived his disapproval quite satisfactorily. Those quotes are from, they did a special event, the 50th anniversary of Parkman Village, and that was part of the presentation that some of the folks did about the whole process and everything. So this is what the Ward and Helen McCartney house looked like when Helen was still living there about 12 years ago, I think. So this is what it looked like then. There was another owner in between, and then John and his wife have it now and are doing restorations and repairs of neglect. And Wright was a brilliant visual architect, but he didn't necessarily have the good idea of how all the engineering should work to make it stable over time. And that's some of the stuff that's being corrected right now, as well as a little bit more insulation. So this is the Robert and Ray Levin house. This one has a wonderful wall of windows that looks directly out over Asylum Lake and the pond. This was the first house that was actually begun in Parkman Village. The concrete block is inside because it was concrete on the inside. It was the textile blocks on the outside and on the inside. And some family came to visit and reported back to family in another part of the country that they're living in a basement. Because that's the only place you had concrete block back in those days. So it's a nice design, but and this is what it looks like. This is from the street. You can see a little bit of that lifted roof that overlooks the lake, and it is a wonderful view down into the lake from there. And again, these are just a couple more views of what it looks like today. It's all textile block. Did I lose it again? Okay. It's all textile block, big overhangs, and I believe there's one addition that was designed by an apprentice or assistant to Frank Lloyd Wright in the early 60s after he passed away. This is the Robert and Winifred Wynn house. To the best of my knowledge, this is one that has never been on a tour. The Historic Preservation Commission did a tour of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses. We managed to get 7 of the 8 existing ones in Kalamazoo in both in Parkman Village and in the Acres, but the Wynn House was the one that we did not get on the tour. So it was a little harder for me to find some of the photographs. But the Wynns, like several of the other owners, did add in some insulation. Their site was not flat, so they couldn't put in, most of the rest of the houses had heat in the floor, the hot water heat in the floor. So radiant heat wouldn't work on this site because it wasn't flat enough to have a single slab as a pour that would hold the radiant heat. So they actually had forced air heat in there. And then the next one, there was one of the typical things of Wright designs is built-in furniture as well as freestanding furniture. And the material that Wright chose was a pine desk. It was pine, and it had actually deteriorated substantially over the years. So some of the owners replaced it. They replaced it with the desks with oak desks. So it's same position, same designs, everything else, but it's just not the same thing exactly. Now this is the Wynn House from behind. These were taken by a fellow from a website called Prairie Mod, and they were here in 2014. There was a Frank Lloyd Wright conference up in Grand Rapids, and they actually came down to Kalamazoo and toured several of the houses. And so these are some of the photographs he took. I couldn't find his name anywhere on the website, but these are photographs he took of the Wynn House. It's got somewhat of a reverse hemicycle design, and we'll see what a hemicycle is when we start talking about the houses out at the Acres. So this is the Acres. Now the Acres also had its circular design lots. They only had 21. They didn't have as many. Parkman had over 40 lots. It was 72 acres. The road follows the contours of the land, and they have the common areas. And the houses were placed on the lots to maximize the view, privacy, and the exposure of both sun and other things. The circular lots they were able to retain because they worked out their financing without having to go to the FHA. So the lots out at the Acres are the original circular lots. So with that said, the Acres is probably the most authentic Frank Lloyd Wright designed Usonian collection anywhere in the United States because it does retain the circular lots. They ran into that problem with the lot layouts in other places where they built some Usonian collections. So this is what the entrance to the Acres looks like. In March 1948, Wright was in town again. He borrowed some galoshes and went tromping through the swampland, although he kept calling it an upland bog instead of a swampland. I just like the idea of him tromping through the mud. I think that's just kind of amusing. It was March after all. It's not what we know in Michigan is our best weather opportunities. So one of the first houses that went up there was the Epstein house, the Dorothy and Samuel Epstein house. They built an awful lot of the house themselves. They had to wash the blocks in hydrochloric acid because, oh no, this is the wrong detail. Okay. Some of the blocks that were built from the houses over by Parkman had to be washed in hydrochloric acid because one of the other names for the little lake that was attached to Asylum Lake back in the 1860s was Lime Lake. It was one of the places where they got a supply of lime to make concrete and make cement to build things with. So there was a very heavy concentration of calcium in the water. And so when they made their blocks using the water from that pond, they got this lime white calcium deposit all over the outside. And the only way to get rid of it was to wash them with hydrochloric acid. So the Epsteins laid the walls, they poured their own floors, and they later built their own furniture. Frank Lloyd Wright's estimate was $15,000, and it came out. Mrs. Epstein in 1999 guesstimated that it had cost $45,000 and taken 20 years. So now that was with escalating prices as time went on. You know, it's not like they paid $45 at the very beginning, but that it had over the long run it had cost them that much to do it. So I mean, but this is not atypical for Wright designs. I can't think of any project that I read about, and I've read 3 or 4 books now, where they said, wow, this came in on time and on budget. So these are other views of the house in color. It has a 2-sided fireplace. The grate extended into past the hearth, and a corner stuck out so far that they were afraid children would fall. So they always kept a chair over that corner to make sure no one would fall and bash their brains out. So the Eric and Pat Pratt house. The Pratts asked them to, I love this point, he wrote to Wright and said, would you design our home for us? And he said, please send your requirements. We're glad to add you to the Galesburg family. Before he mailed the letter, though, Wright neatly crossed out the word family and substituted victims. I think he got a little bit of cynic in him there, you know, just a little bit. The owners did a lot of the work themselves, and they actually visited Taliesin and stayed for a weekend. Taliesin West out in Arizona, with the Weiss Blatts, and stayed for a weekend, and they were just kind of in awe of the great man. So this is the Eric and Pat Pratt House. That's the one I'm thinking of. Okay. So that's what it looks like today when they were doing the tour in May of 2014 was when the tour took place. So the trees were leaved out, and it just was looking pretty nice. I mean, it is kind of a comfy looking house. Now this is the David and Christine Weiss Blatt house. It was built in 1949. One of Wright's apprentices, Jack Howe, designed an addition. And Christine Weiss Blatt, I believe the Weiss Blatt family still owns the house, but it's the descendants, it's the children. I don't believe there are any of the original owners still alive. Christine said, we realized that we were regarded as oddballs and it didn't bother us. So they added insulation in the space between the textile blocks, and they said that actually it was a pretty comfortable house to live in. They did add shrubberies around the house, though, because when the wind came in from a certain direction, it would just drive the rain right into the blocks and into the dead space in between the blocks, and then the whole inside of the house would be damp. So they did add some shrubberies just to break the wind. Wright never would have approved of that as well, but apparently he never came back and gave him any grief over it. So this is the Meyer house. This is the Hemicycle house. This is a quarter circle design facing east. The preformed concrete blocks, these are textile blocks, but they're in a slight curved shape, and they were painted white, and the exterior wood was stained mahogany. This one is being restored by Tony, what's his name? Doug Labrat, and he's doing just a splendid job. He's doing a beautiful job on it. The house was neglected for a long time. Any house that's neglected of any design by any architect is going to eventually have a lot of trouble. So, and this is what it looks like today. I'd just move into that in a heartbeat. I mean, I just like it. Even if it wasn't right, I just like the design. So this was the Curtis and Lillian Meyer house. And you can see where the other one, I said it was kind of a reverse hemicycle because it was concave instead of convex. Although this is kind of concave at the back. But okay, so these are just some of the sources I used. I told Beth this is the first time I've ever done a bibliography for one of my presentations, but I felt I brought in a lot of information from other sources, and because I didn't want to go traipsing around people's yards, I didn't go and take fresh pictures. I had some, but I'd taken them on film years ago, and they turned out really bad. So, but these are some of there's books on Frank Lloyd Wright, hundreds of books. He actually designed 2 houses for Ladies' Home Journal, one in 1901, another one about 1906. Several of the 1906 ones were actually built. That's Frank Lloyd Wright. Questions for a non-Wright expert. And did I get anything terribly wrong, you folks back there? No? Yes?
Are there any houses in Parkman Village that are not designed by Frank?
Absolutely. There's over 40 lots there, and he only designed the 4. There was one more, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was a Wright design that the family moved out of town for a little while and then moved back, and they weren't able to complete it originally, and so they had, I believe Norman Carver modified it for them, so I consider that to be a half Wright, you know? It's the not right? Okay, well, that's good. I like that. Okay, that's good too. But no, the rest, yeah, so there's a lot of other houses. If you drive out there, you'll see some very standard ranch-style houses, but some other ones that have some very nice designs, especially the stuff Norm Carver has done. He's done some really nice ones. Yeah?
What's the meaning of the word USonian?
Nobody is really entirely clear on that. There's a lot of debate. United States of North America was one of the ideas. Wright never specifically defined it to anybody that was recorded. So we don't know. And yes?
A number of years ago, I lived on Crown Street. Is that what you were referring to? I remember that what was unique about that street was that it had some sort of plumbing or system that had been designed, and then they asked a bunch of different architects to design homes on that street to prove the versatility of that particular plumbing.
That might be. I don't know the names of the streets out at Ingersoll Village, but that sounds familiar. So it's off of Alamo, right out in that area by Hillside Junior High and out that direction?
Yes,
yes.
And
Yeah.
somebody had actually come to that house they wanted to try to turn it into, what is it called, like a historic.
Oh yeah, well they.
Or something like that, but everybody in the neighborhood was going to have to agree, and I think I was the only one that was interested.
Well, it would be eligible because of its unique history. Yeah. So it would be an eligible site. I believe that we had, when we did the tour in the Frank Lloyd Wright tour that we did back in the early 2000s, I think they looked at Ingersoll Village and actually talked about adding that as another stop, but I don't think that actually came through. But it's an interesting little area. Yeah, you're right. That's the place. That's where it is. Yes.
I believe some of the homes on Crown were designed to hold them down.
Yes, absolutely. He also designed the church on, is it Broadway and Winchell? I believe, right next to the Winchell Elementary. He designed that church as well. So, yeah. Well, keep in mind that he designed them in the late 40s and early 50s. They don't have garages. They have carports. Yeah, Wright was the person who actually was the first person who came up with the idea of a carport. So they just have the overhangs. Now, and I don't believe that any of the families have actually turned the carport into garages. However, they have added bedrooms by enclosing the carports. Anything else? Yes?
We were very lucky to know all four of the families out of the acres. And in May of 2001, it was the first time, I believe, 7 of the homes were open to the public.
Mm-hmm.
There were visitors from as far away as Japan, Frank Lloyd Wright. And it was, oddly enough, a very bittersweet moment for these families. I remember the reception at the Art Center, the big room at the KIA, and the Pratt and the Epstein girls were talking, and they said, this is very bittersweet for us because when we went to the Galesburg schools, we were harassed continuously. It was considered a very odd sort of thing. The families were considered odd, and for the women to see the community celebrating this, it gave them some conflicting feelings.
And I could see where it might have, in some minor way, maybe counterbalanced that a little bit, and said that, now that it came out with people admiring these houses. So, thank you for that, Martha. Anything else? Yeah.
Are there any plans to have another tour event?
Because in the last few years is when these houses have been turning over from either their original owners or from the second to the third owners. Several of them are under renovation right now and restoration. So we had been thinking, rather than doing a hidden Kalamazoo tour again this year, we were thinking of doing a Wright tour, but enough of the houses were in that stage of we're not ready for this yet, that we thought we'd just put it off. We'd love to do it again. It would be a matter of whether we can get the support of these families. This is their home. Would they be willing to let people come traipsing through them? They just had the experience last year of all the Frank Lloyd Wright fans, and there were about 50 more.
I wouldn't say it was 100.
3 buses loads of people that came down and traipsed through the houses and everything. So you need a while to recover from that before you do it again. We would love to make them because I think this is one of the treasures of Kalamazoo. Where of course we're going to respect the family's wishes, but if we could do it, we would love to do it again. I wouldn't expect it to be any sooner than at least 2 or 3 years from now, though. And you will know about it. Yes.
How many Frank Lloyd Wright houses are there?
8. Well, if you say Kalamazoo County, there's 4 at Parkman, and that's inside the city limits. And then there's 4 in Charleston Township, just outside Galesburg. So the total is 8.5 if you count the hybrid one. So, the not right. So, yeah, so that's 8. And that's really, every place else that has Usonians, they've got 2 or 3. So we really do have one of the biggest collections between the 2 sites, and even the biggest collection as one single site in the U.S. Well, not anywhere else. He didn't build Usonians anywhere else, so we have the biggest set. So any other questions, thoughts, ideas? Ingersoll was a company that they made tanks, and they did all sorts of other things. They were manufacturers, and one of their ideas was this wonderful, unit that would have all your systems in it in one place. You just had to add the plumbing and everything. So this was right after the Second World War. They were looking for things for the factories that had made planes, something else to do. The Ingersoll core was one thing that was an idea. Have you heard of the Lustron houses? Okay, the ones that were made of metal panels that were enameled. It's the only type of historic house that it's appropriate to use Bondo to repair. So there was another idea, was let's get these houses manufactured. Let's make lots of houses for people, because there was this horrible housing shortage after the war when all the GIs came home. So, so this was just, USonian was part of that, the Ingersolls that were definitely part of that, and they were thinking of doing more, but it never went far enough. I mean, Levittown was the one that was the most successful, where they built thousands of houses out on the East Coast. But yeah. Okay, yes, there is. There's some really great pictures of the Ingersoll houses on the library website. Okay, before you go, I want to put one more plug in for the Hidden Kalamazoo tour next year. Father's Day weekend again, the 18th and 19th of June. We already have 3 sites. We've got one site that I'm not going to say, but I'm very, very, very excited about, because it's never been on anybody's tour ever. So, I mean, you won't have seen this one. I'm just very excited about it. And we're probably going to be using City Hall as our hub, and we're going to have a display there for people that can come and see that, and then they can go see the rest of the tour. So if you're not on our Facebook page already, friend us, and you can follow everything, all of our plans as we develop them over the next year. And if anybody has big buckets of money and they would like to sponsor us, just give me a call. Okay. Even little buckets, yeah, that'd be fine. It'd be fine. Or you want to print 150 T-shirts for us or whatever. So, okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, it's Hidden Kalamazoo. Yep, just Hidden Kalamazoo. Yep. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming.